Today we're going to be learning Pesachim Daf Samach Zayin. Today's daf is sponsored by Devorah Shapira for the Refuah Shlema of Yitzchak Daniel ben Batya Ilana and Moshe Zev, and by Farber Goldschlag for the Refuah Shlema of Avram Gidon ben Chana, wishing him a speedy and easy recovery from his surgery today. And by Leslie Treff in loving memory of her mother and father, Walter and Adele. Today was their anniversary. We're going to start at the bottom. I'm just going to remind you what we were up to because we're in the middle of something. It's always good to go back and try and remember what we were up to. So what we discussed after getting through the very interesting story of Hillel and B'nai B'tera, I hope you found interesting things about it in other places. As I said, we didn't have enough time to go through it. But now we're back to our topic, which is we started off by comparing the Korban Pesach to the Korban Tamid to say that it overrides Shabbat, just like the Korban Tamid, the daily sacrifice overrode Shabbat, meaning you can slaughter it and all sorts of other things associated with it. And then there was a debate, where we draw the line versus this other issue, which now instead of learning from the daily sacrifice to Pesach, we're going to learn from Pesach to all the other sacrifices. So now they wanted to know, and what's the issue? The issue is Tum'ah hutra b'tzibur, this very interesting halacha that the rabbis said that if the majority of the community are impure, and we're going to see what it means is just impurity to death, meaning let's say some important person died and everybody went to the funeral and they all became tamei lameh, or again, more than 50% of the people, or more than 50% of the kohanim, then we basically say, we're allowed to bring the Korban Pesach anyway. That's what we call Tum'ah hutra b'tzibur. We permit Tum'ah when it comes to the public, something needed by the public. So we learn from Pesach that the same thing will be true for the daily sacrifice. Same thing. Most of the Kohanim are Tme'im. There it would only be Kohanim. It wouldn't be relevant to the community because the community doesn't bring the daily sacrifice. It's representative of the community, but it doesn't matter if they're Tme'im. Just like we learned, if you remember, all impure people can send korbanot in the hands of other people. That's fine. It's only Pesach that there's a special law that you can't be Tamei and have the Pesach brought for you. So the question is, where do we derive that? So we saw two different answers yesterday. We started with Rabbi Yochanan, who said we're going to learn it from the pasuk, Ish kiya tamei lanefesh. And there it says, if you have individuals who are impure on Pesach, then they go and they give the Korban Pesach the next month. That's an exemption only for individuals. So therefore, what does Rabbi Yochanan say? From there, you can infer, what if it was many people? Oh, then it must be they're allowed to do it on Pesach. To which Rish Lakish said, that's a bad excuse. He says, why don't you just say they can't do it at all, right? There's three options. There's either we can do it Pesach Rishon, or you could do a Pesach Sheni, or you can't do it at all. You have no resolution. So, and you would think, if you didn't know this concept, you can see where Rish Lakish is coming from. If you didn't know this concept that we're going to allow impurity when the majority of the community, you would definitely assume that we wouldn't allow this at all. And as Pesach Sheni is something for individuals, but the community, forget about it. They have to miss Pesach that year. So he says that's not a good proof. So therefore comes Rish Lakish with this other pasuk, kind of out of left field. And he says, I'm going to learn it from this pasuk. Let's start back from there. We did this yesterday. We'll do it again though. We're going to have a lot to do with this pasuk today. So let's get it clear. This is a pasuk in Sefer Bamidbar when they set up the camp in the desert. They say, and by the way, now that we've set up the camp, I want you to know there's certain people that can't be in the camp. Okay, who can't be in the camp? So a tzarua, someone who's leprous, a zav. Okay, they call it gonorrhea. It's a certain disease that causes men to have a discharge, and chol tamei lanefesh, and anyone who's impure to a dead person. So now, how do we get from this pasuk to our topic? Well, let's see what they say about it. Okay, I'll already tell you that. And I learned this with my daughter a few years ago. She's in elementary school. They were learning Sefer Bamidbar. And I remember I built this thing for her so that she'd understand this concept that there's three different machanot. And this is, basic aleph bet. And I say this because I want you to know that this is not 100% clear in the Gemara. And that's why I want to set it up in the beginning. When you learn that pasuk, when you're in school, the way they teach that pasuk is, so there's three camps and there's three different people that we're talking about here. And each one has different camps that he's not allowed to be in. The way they were in the desert, there was the Machaneh Shechina, that was where the Mishkan was. There was the Machaneh Leviyah, those are the people around there that were camped around the Mishkan, and that was all the Leviim. And then around that, you have the four camps of, three Shvatim in each one, of the people sit around. Now, if you're mitzora, you're outside all three. You can't be in any of those. If you're a zav, you can't be in the two middle ones, the machane leviyah and the machane shechina. If you're tmei lanefesh, meaning you're a tmei meit, you became impure to a dead person, you're only not allowed to be in the middle one, okay, in the center, in the machane shechina. Now, those parallel when it comes to the second temple. The machane shechina is the temple and the azarot, basically, like even the Ezrat Nashim, I think, is included in there. That area you're not allowed to go. When it comes, the second camp, the machane leviyah, is the Har HaBayit, that whole area, the Temple Mount. And the third area is Yerushalayim. And I saw also written that it's also, I don't know if this is according to all opinions, but it also includes any walled cities from the time of Yoshua. Okay, so that's the parallel in the Bayit Sheni world, okay, in the time of the second temple. Now, I say this because that's how this pasuk is generally read. And each one has different criteria, okay, which machanot they can't be part of. Okay, so you already see the order, and we're going to discuss this today. How do we know that this is the order in terms of severity, right? There's, in terms of the halacha, it's clear that the mitzvah is the most strict, the zav is middle, and the tamei lanefesh is the least strict, which might have gone counter to what you might have thought, right? Tamei lanefesh seems to be stricter in certain ways, but we'll talk about that later. So how does Rish Lakish get it from this verse? So what does he say? He says, now again, forgetting about the fact that the reason it mentions all three are in order to say each one has its own machaneh. I taught you that just so that if you thought that on your own already, because you know that, you take it out of your mind, because that's not the way Rish Lakish reads this pasuk. He says, Yomar tmei mitim va'al yamer zavinu mitzoraim. You could have just said, tmei meit is the least of all. Let's just assume right now, again, not so clear why, but right now they're going to say that's the least severe. So if he can't be in the machaneh, then it would have been obvious that Zavinu Mitzoraim can't be in the machaneh, right? Va'al yamer Zavinu Mitzoraim, you don't need to say those. Vani omer, and then I would say what? Tmei meitim mishtachim, Zavinu Mitzoraim lo kol sheken, all the more so they will not be allowed to be in the camp. Ella. So therefore, why does it say all three? Okay, now it's a little bit tricky because this doesn't really say why does it say all three. This really answers why it would say two. Okay, and that's going to be part of the question on this answer. So now, and yes, this is just a different proof to prove Tumah Trabat Tzibor. Nobody disagrees with the halacha of Tumahu Trabat Tzibor. Everybody agrees with it. The question is only, where do we derive it from? So he's going to say we're going to get to Tumah Trabat Tzibor from the fact that it says Tmei Emet and Zavinu Mitzoraim. So he says like this, it must distinguish between them for a particular reason. To tell you what, אלא יש לך שעה שזמינו מצורעים משטחים ואין טמאי מת משטחים ואיזה פסח הבא בטומאה. He says very simply, the reason, this is not really the pshat of this pasuk, the reason it mentions all three, and the pasuk says you have to remove them from your camp. They cannot be in your camp. Come say, why does it say all three? It's to say, well, it's true they all have to be out of the camp, but there's different laws for each of them. And there is a time when one of those are allowed back in the camp. And that's Tmei Meit are allowed in when the majority of the community is impure. Okay, that's how he gets it. So to which Abaye says, Amar Abaye, Hachi, Lemanami Yomar Zav Utmei Mitim, Ba'al Yomar Mitzorah. I could take your logic and I can make it say something that's not actually the halacha. If you want to use that logic, I'll twist that logic on you. You could say very simply, and this is why I said there's three things here and not two. That caused a bit of a problem. You could say Zavut Tmei Meitim. You could say 2 out of the 3 are permitted, right? Because there's some distinction. Why do you draw the line between 1 versus 2 and 3? Or it's actually 1 and 2 versus 3, because the Tmei Lanefesh is the last one. Why don't you draw the line between 1 and 2 and 3? So he says, Vani Omer, and then I would say, Zav Mishtaleach, Mitzorah Lo Kol Sheken. I would ask the question between the Zav and the Mitzorah, the same question you asked between the Zav and the Tmei Lanefesh. I would say once you have Zav, obviously Mitzorah can't be part of the camp. And if so, what does it come to teach you? And so then he would say, I can give you the opposite logic. I can take your logic and I can use it to prove that the Zav and the Tmei Meitim are allowed in the camp if the majority of the people are Zavim. And that's not the case. So basically, your logical, which seems like a nice logical argument, doesn't really work because you could take it and twist it to say something different. So therefore, Abaye has his own reason, and he's going to really go back to Rabbi Yochanan and prove Rabbi Yochanan. So in the end, it's kind of 3 answers, but it's really 2 because he's going to really go back and explain better Rabbi Yochanan against Rish Lakish's question. Oh, before I get there, wait, I forgot, we're not there yet. He says, by the way, I said it is if it was a blanket statement and obvious that Zav is not Hutra B'tzibur. Right? If the majority of the people are Zavim, that doesn't mean that you can do the Korban Pesach. So he wants to say, by the way, maybe you'll say, maybe Zavim are allowed, but I'm going to prove to you that it's not the case. V'hatnan, it says in the Mishnah, Pesach haba b'tum'ah, lo yochlu mimenu Zavim v'zavot nidot v'yildot. By the way, when we say Zav, it's a catch-all phrase, not just for a Zav, also for a Zava, which is a woman who has bleeding. It's not during the time of her period or beyond the time of her period. And Nidot, a Nida, woman when she's menstruating, and Yoldot, okay, and women who give birth. So all of those are in the same category. Now you might think that on a year when, in other words, the Mishnah says, when we have a year where the majority of the people are Tme'im, and then they can all go and eat their Korban Pesach in the temple, you might have thought, right, or not you might have thought, Pesach haba b'tumah lo yochlu mimenu. It can't be eaten by Zavim, Zavot, Nidot, V'yoldot. Okay, they're not included in this the hetel, right? This permissive action. V'imachlu p'turim. But if they did eat, they're exempt. This is interesting. This is an aside thing. That's not the main point why Abaye brought this, but we're going to see this later also. It says, V'lo yitam'u et machanehem. Okay? Lo yitamu et machanehem. It says first send them out, and then it says, and they shouldn't make my camp tameh, impure, which means this is a lo taseh. If it's a lo taseh, you get lashes for it. So he says there is one exception here, that on a year when everyone who became impure to a dead person is allowed, because the majority of the people are like that, then they can all go eat their Pesach. If it happens that year, some other people who were impure, these Zavim, Yoldot, Nidot, all those, they came in and they ate the Pesach, they wouldn't get lashes that year. Okay, they're exempt from punishment. It's not to say they're allowed, but they don't get punished because it's a bit of an off year. Okay, since the kind of issue of Tumah has already been permitted, we're not going to say you can come in, but we're also not going to say that you're going to get punished if you do it. Okay, so there's a bit of an exception. But the point is that you can't say we're drawing the line between the Tmei Nefesh and Zav on one hand and the Mitzvah on the other, and therefore I don't like your logical argument that you're going to learn it from this pasuk because I don't think it's very random that you chose to put the line there and not there. And maybe if it said 2 things, we would say that, but the fact that it says 3 makes it not a good drasha. So Ela Amar Abaye. So Abaye goes back. Lo'olam mikra kama. I'm going to go back to the first pasuk, but I'm going to learn it a little bit differently than Rabbi Yochanan did. And he says, so now, okay, so you're asking why, if the whole tzibur is allowed, I see Becky's asking the question, this is exactly what the Gemara is going to say. Or again, we're going to learn it from a drasha. Okay, it's not going to necessarily give you your answer as to why, but it's going to say where we learn it from. Im kein nichtov rachmana ish ki yetameh la nefesh lamali. This is his topic sentence. We're not going to yet understand how he gets to there. It's going to take a little bit of time till we get to exactly how he gets it from there. But he says in the verse about Pesach Sheni, that if you miss Pesach Rishon because you were impure, so you can do it on the second Pesach. It says there, ish ki yetameh la nefesh. Now it could have just said if you're impure, because the fact is, and we're going to see this soon, that law applies to anyone who's impure, not just someone who's impure because of death, because they were in contact with a dead person. So la nefesh lamali, what do you need that verse la nefesh to teach you? That word la nefesh. Now, if you want to say, hi la nefesh lahachi huda'ata, maybe it's coming for a simple reading of that verse. If you read that verse and you didn't know halacha, what would you assume it meant? Hatamei meit hu dinitcha lepesach sheni aval shar tmeim lo. You would have thought that, what does it mean? Ish ki yetameh la nefesh. That means who's it, right? And then it says obaderech rechoka. So if I asked you a simple question and you were reading the pshat of that pasuk, what would you say? Who's allowed to do pesach sheni? Someone who's too far away to get there, and someone who was in contact with a dead person, and only in contact with a dead person, not that they had some other type of impurity that prevented them from getting to the temple. But that's not true. Tanya, he says, it says in a Braita, a different answer, a different explanation, and that's not the case halachically. Yachol lo, and here's the Breita. The Breita is going to start off a classic midrash halacha type of style. You might have thought this, and then the pasuk tells us otherwise. Yachol lo yuhu osim pesach sheni ela tmei metim shaya b'derech rechoka. Exactly what we just suggested. Maybe only if you're impure to dead people. Zavinu mitzoraim uboalei nidot minayin. So where do we get that if you're a zav or you're a mitzora, and for that reason you couldn't come to the temple, and boalei nidot, it's interesting, they don't say nidot themselves. They talk about people who sleep with a woman who's a nida, because that person also takes tumah, becomes tameh. Maybe they're just focusing on the men, and therefore they word it in the male. What about those people? Talmud lomar ish ish. That's why it says ish ish. Ish ish could have just said ish, right? Why does it say the same word twice? The reason it says, right, a man, right? It's a very weird sentence to translate, right? A man who is tamei lenefesh. Why would you say that twice? So, right, ish ish in Hebrew at least sounds a little more like it flows, but in English it really wouldn't make any sense. In any case, it's an extra word, even in Hebrew, and therefore ish ish comes to teach you even other types of people who are tamei. Well, if that's the case, then we have an obvious question. La nefesh dekata rachman alamali. So why does it then say someone who is tamei to a soul, right, which means a dead person? Why would it say that? So now it's to teach us our halacha. How does it teach us our halacha? Elahachi kama, what it's to teach you. Now remember what Rish Lakish said to Rabbi Yochanan. I agree with you that they don't do any of the tzibor, doesn't do Pesach Sheni, but I could easily say, instead of saying they do Pesach Rishon, I could just say they don't have any option to do it at all. So what does Lanefesh come to say, according to Abaye? Ish nidche Pesach Sheni ve'ein tzibor nidche Pesach Sheni. Okay, so far that's simple, right? The Ish gets to do Pesach Rishon, not the community. But now, why did it say, right? Lanefesh ela avde betuma. Okay, it's to tell you that there is a way that you can do it. It's to teach you that there's a unique halacha, someone who's tamei lanefesh, that's different from all other tumah. So if we say there's two options, either you can never do it at all, or you can do it Pesach Rishon while you're all impure, we're going to say lanefesh comes to say there's a split. Some go one way, some go the other way. So then lanefesh is going to tell you, oh, it's the people who are Tmeim Lanefesh that have an opportunity even on Pesach Rishon to do it. And every other type of Tumah, if the majority of the community has that type of impurity, or let's say we have Zavim and Mitzoraim, and all together they constitute a majority, then we would not allow it. Okay? So that's where he gets it from the word Lanefesh. And so he takes Rabbi Yochanan, but he takes him one step farther and explains it's really from the word lanefesh, which comes to say there is one difference, because lanefesh, there is no difference in Pesach Sheni if you're tamei lanefesh or some other tumah. So there must be something else where there's a difference, and then it must be our halacha. Okay, and that's how he gets to the conclusion that it's only tamei lanefesh. So Becky, it answered your question where it comes from, but it doesn't really answer your question why that's the case. I have a suggestion as to why it's the case. If you think about it, it's much more common that the majority of the people will be Tmei Lanefesh rather than the majority of the people will be Zavim. Zav is a very rare condition. Okay, Nidot, maybe you could say, but it still wouldn't affect the majority of the people, because 50%, let's say, even if more people are women, you're not going to have, right? Even if you say women usually are a little more than 50% of the population, you're not going to have, right, the majority of the population being a Nida or a Yoledet or any of those categories. You're not going to ever end up with all the women. And I think that normally when they make these, not that I think, but normally in general, when the rabbis came and gave some special dispensation, they did it in a case it was a possibility. Like, let's say a huge gadol ador dies right before Pesach. You can imagine, right? Everyone, the whole community is going to go. They're all going to be tmeim, and then we're going to have this problem. So I think it's just a more realistic thing that could happen. Of course, it's hard not to think about this, about contagious and corona and how fast it's spreading. And, I know they were just saying yesterday that we don't think anything's going to, there'll be no real travel to Israel until Pesach. You think about this idea of Pesach and the rate of the spread of the disease and how fast it could spread. You can almost think that, thank God we're not at the majority of the community, but you could think about something maybe spreading in a very fast way, but unlikely that it's going to affect the majority of the community. Anyway, that I couldn't help but think about that while I was learning this. Okay, so that's our section. So this was all to basically say that where do we get this idea that tum'ah hutra b'tzibur? Okay, and we learned it from either ish with the combination of the word lanefesh to say that yes, the others no, and or we can learn it from Now comes Rav Chisda. Because we're talking about this mitzvah and this verse, we're now going to darshan this pasuk. Amar Rav Chisda. So we're very off topic right now. If a mitzorah goes into a space where he's not allowed to go, right, which is any of the three machanot, he's exempt. He doesn't get lashes. This isn't Pesach. This is in general. Never gets lashes. Why? Shene'emar badad yeshev michutz lemachane moshavo. Hakatuv nitko la'aseh. Okay, this is a very difficult line. I'll try to explain it, and I'll already tell you the gefet. So there's a great shiur of gefet, 15-minute shiur on our site. It's in Hebrew. If your Hebrew's good, of Rabbanit it's also written up if you prefer to read. Their content's always written and video with also great PowerPoint presentations with it to really show the flow of what's going on here. The big machloket Rashi Tosfot here, and that's the whole purpose of gefet, is to learn through basic Rashi Tosfot. And it's to show this big machloket that exists. So Rabbanit Dreyfus does an excellent job of explaining the two machlokot. I'm going to mention it very briefly because it's not really a place for a daf yomi shiur, but I'll kind of mention that there's a big issue in these verses. So what's going on here? We have first we have to know what is a katuv nitzko la'aseh. Let's start with that. There's something called a lav hanitak la'aseh. Okay, one of the classic examples is notar. We've talked about that. You leave over your food, right? And your sacrificial meat beyond the time that you're allowed to. So it says, lo totiru mimenu ad boker, don't leave it over till the morning. V'hanotar mimenu ad boker ba'esh yisaref. But whatever you did, you burn. So that means what? There's actually two different ways to understand this. I'll go with one for right now, just to keep things somewhat simple, although know that not everyone agrees with this. Some people view this as, what's the point of a punishment? A punishment is to make you repent, right? It's to fix what you did. So in these kind of cases, the Torah already prescribes how you're supposed to fix the problem. You're supposed to burn it if you did it. If you did it wrong, well, then burn it. Or if you stole something, return the stolen item. So that's your punishment, and it replaces the usual punishment that there is. What's the problem here? Usually, when you have this, first of all, usually the lo taseh comes first. It says, don't do this. And then if you did it, this is how you should fix it. So that's number one problem. Here, what's this badad yeshev? So first, and the second thing is they're usually mentioned next to each other. Here we have a verse in Bamidbar, which we said, that's send out of the camp all these people, and then below yitamu et machanehem, and they should not mess up your camp. And then it says, in Sefer Vayikra, when it's talking about the Mitzorah specifically and not about the camping in the desert. So first of all, it's before, and second of all, it's nowhere near in the Torah. And it says, badad yeshev michutz lamachaneh moshavot. He should sit alone outside the place of where the camp is. So they say, and that's right, send them out. They shouldn't litameh, and then they should sit by themselves. So there's a machloket Rashi tells us whether this is a typical, right? Rashi tries to understand this. It's not exactly your typical lavanitak laseh. Rashi tries to explain, and this is what Chana Dreyfus sets up beautifully, that Rashi tries to basically fit it into the usual concept that we know of a lavanitak laseh, and it's not so easy to do that, and he kind of has to like push it through and explain in a way that's not so simple. Tosfot basically says this is a different type of lavanitak laseh, and it doesn't try to fit it into what we generally know. He says this is an exception, and when they say it's nitak laseh, they don't really mean the classic lavanitak laseh. Okay, that's kind of, in a nutshell, what the machloket is. Okay, but let's just assume somehow it's something like a lav hanitak laseh, and therefore comes Rav Chisda and says you don't get lashes on this because, again, as I said, at least according to one interpretation, there's two, and kind of brings up the two, but I'll just bring up one, but to keep it simple. But this idea that you already have a resolution to it, you don't need a different punishment. That's your kind of resolution. So yeah, that's Rav Chisda. So he says there's no lashes. Now we're going to have a problem with this because Eitive, it says in this different Tanaitic source that you do get lashes for this. So what does it say? The exact same case. He went into a place where he's not allowed to go. Ba'arba'im means he gets 40. That means he gets 40 lashes. So you get lashes for this. Zavim v'zavot. Okay, now we're just continuing in the Braita, not necessarily right. We don't need this anymore. We brought it for what we need, but let's continue anyway. Zavim v'zavot shenichnesu lifnim mechitzatam ba'arba'im. Also, a zav and a zava that go into an area they're not allowed to, right? The machaneh leviyah, they also get 40 lashes. Utmei mate, someone who became impure to a dead person, mutar likanes lemachaneh leviyah. Now they're just telling you that, by the way, it's mate. Okay, I already told you this, but we didn't know this before. So the bright, like us, let's assume. So the bright is telling you it's mate can go into machaneh leviyah. He can only, right, and not only the mate. And here we're going to learn something from our parsha this week. Not only the mate, even the mate atzmo. Okay, we have a lot of connections these days to the parsha since we're learning all the parshiyot, right? This actually randomly connects, right? Until now, right? Last week's parsha was all about all the sacrifice of the Korban Pesach that we've been learning. Here it says, even the meit atzmo, even a dead body itself is allowed in the machaneh leviyah. Forget about someone who came in contact with the dead body. Even the dead body, how do we know this? Shneimar, when they go to leave Egypt, what does it say? Vayikach Moshe et atzmot Yosef imo. He takes the bones of Yosef with him. What does it mean with him? Must have been in the camp of Moshe. Where did Moshe live? He's a Levi. He lives with the Leviim. Okay, so there you have it, that even the dead body is allowed. We learn it from the bones of Yosef. Dead bodies allowed to be in the machaneh leviyah. So, and how do they darshan this? Imo b'mechitzato, because it says imo, he took it with him. They learn with him means literally with him in where he was living. Okay, so we're stuck with Rav Chisda says you don't get lashes, and the Braita says you do get lashes. So now they say, wait a minute. So how do we resolve this? So they say very simply, okay, there's a classic answer when you have, remember, the rules are in a Mora can't disagree with something a Tana said, unless you can say that the Tana himself, right, there was a debate about it in the time of the Tanaim. So that's what the Gemara says. They say, sorry, did I skip something? No, I lost my place for 1 second. Tanaihi. I just couldn't find those words. Okay, Tanaihi. So what do they say? This is a machloket Tanaim. There's a Tanaitic debate. And now we're going to bring, and that's going to lead us to a whole discussion on the second part of today's stuff, which is we're going to discuss this machloket Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon. First, we're going to simply show that one uses the verse Badad Yeshev to teach something else, which means it can't teach you that it's a lavanitak laseh, and therefore you do get lashes. The second opinion is going to say it's a lavanitak laseh, okay, and you don't get lashes. So, and therefore we're going to say Rav Chisda held by the second opinion, and therefore the Braita that we just quoted that says you do get lashes held like Rabbi Yehuda, the first opinion. So let's read the Braita. Ditanya. Badad Yeshev, what do we learn from that verse? Livado Yeshev, he sits by himself. What does that come to teach you? Again, what does it teach you? This halacha that I told you that we learn in whatever grade we learn when we learn Sefer Bamidbar, and it's obvious to everyone, but now we need to see where did they get it from. So according to the first opinion, they get it from the fact that it says the leper sits alone. If he sits alone, that means that if we send all, if you read that verse, you would have thought they all have to go out of the same space. So where do we get all of a sudden that there's different spaces where each one's allowed or not allowed to be? So he says, Levado Yeshev, it says he has to sit badad. Badad means alone with nobody else, meaning there's somewhere where he can't be that everyone else is allowed to be. Okay, so that basically proves to you what? That the Mitzorah is outside, let's just assume, all three camps, and then the Zav and the Tzmei Meit are not. So now the question is, well, what about them, right? Are they both chutz mishnei machanot, or only one, or both, or right? What's the story? So they say you might have thought they could be mishtachim lemachaneh echad. So how do we know that they have different laws from each other? Talmud lomar v'lo yitamu et machanehem. You cannot defile the camps. Sounds like multiple camps. So what are they darshan from this? Litei machaneh lezeh or machaneh lezeh divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says so. But Badad Yeshev comes to teach us the Mitzorah is outside of all three. Machanehem teaches us that there's a distinction between the different machanot when it comes also to the Zav and the Tzmei Lanefesh. So he uses Badad Yeshev for that, which means he doesn't use Badad Yeshev to teach you it's a lavanitak laseh, that there's this positive that fixes the negative, and therefore you wouldn't get lashes. No, he would get lashes, and that fits the Braita. Now Rav Chisda matches Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon Omer no tzarich. Why are you learning these laws from a different verse? You can learn it straight from the verse itself. And as if you have a choice and you want to learn a halacha about something that's mentioned in the verse, better to learn it from the verse itself. So comes Rabbi Shimon and he says, why are you taking it from this pasuk in Vayikra about the Mitzorah? And then you're stuck with, well, where do you learn the Zav from? And you learn the Zav is different from Tmei Me'ed, and we learn that from somewhere else. Why don't you just go simple? I'll learn it straight from that pasuk. How? Okay, this is a little bit long, so be patient. Again, we started with this earlier today, right? Why does it have to say all of them? You could have just simply said Tmei Emet, and then I would have known the Zav. I would have said very simply, if you just said Tmei Emet, can't be in the Machaneh, I would have said, obviously also the Zav, because the Zav is more stringent. Later, we're going to ask, how do we know it's more stringent? Lama ne'emar Zav. So why is Zav mentioned in addition to Tmei Emet? And if I had asked you before class, if you learned this verse and you would have known, how do we know it's 3? You probably say this, which is, right? Each one is mentioned separately to say each one has to be removed from a different camp. So that's what the Zav is mentioned to say. It has to go out from an additional camp. Okay, so I get Zav. Zav is to be there to say it's outside one more camp. What about the Mitzorah? I could have, again, once I have Zav, and once the Zav is out, of course the Mitzorah is out, because the Mitzorah is more stringent than the Zav. So, Lama Nemar Mitzorah, Litain Lo Machaneh Shlishit. So the reason Mitzorah is mentioned is to say it's out of an additional camp. So, Kishuhu Omer Badad Yeshev. So according to him now, what does he say? Well, now we have this other verse, Badad Yeshev, which we no longer need to say the Mitzorah has its own place where he can't be, that everyone else is allowed to be. So, Akatuv needs kol aseh. It must be to say, we want to have an aseh that goes with the lo taseh to say that you don't get lashes. So there you see Rav Chisda. So now we have to understand Rabbi Shimon more. Where does he set up this system of stringent, lenient, right? Who's to say one's more stringent or lenient than the other? Why is the Zav more stringent than Tmei Emet? And this comes up in many places. The Zav is a tumah that comes from within his body. Tmei Emet is something that comes from external. You come in contact with a dead body. That's not something internal in your body. Zav is something the man has some sort of disease that's causing this discharge. So they say, if that's what you think, though, Adrabah, I'll prove the reverse. Tmei Emet chamor, there's some chumra about Tmei Emet that doesn't exist by Zav. What is that? Shakein ta'un haza'ash l'shiu shvi'i. You have to sprinkle the purification waters from the para aduma, the red heifer, on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. You don't have to do such a thing with the Zav. The Zav, I'll give you some basics, and we're going to see some of these later, so I'll tell you already now. If a Zav has one discharge, he's called, okay, that's the first category of a Zav. He has tumah for 1 day, okay, regular classic tumah of a day. If he sees twice, then, okay, and it's in a row, there's all details about how. We'll get to this all in Nida. We have a long time. But if he sees 2, then he has to wait already 7 days. He's tameh for 7 days. If he sees 3 re'iyot, 3 times, then he has to also bring a sacrifice. Okay, those are some basic laws about a Zav. So even when he has the 7 days, though, there's no sprinkling process that goes on. So Tmei Emet seems to be more strict. So they say, Amar Kra, Tameh, Vichol Tameh. If you notice in that verse, and we didn't talk about this, but we're going to talk about it now, it says, all Tsarua, all Zav, and all Tameh LaNefesh. Why does it say the word all? Could have just said, take out of the Machaneh, Tsarua Zav, V'Tameh LaNefesh. So what does all Tameh LaNefesh come to say? Vichol, Lirabot Tameh Sheret. It's to teach you also Tumat Sheret. Now, Tumat Sheret doesn't have sprinkling. It doesn't even have 7 days. If you come in contact with one of those creepy crawling creatures, you become tameh immediately, right? And you go to the mikvah. You can go right then, and you have to just wait till the night, and you're already pure. So that's clearly more light than Zav. Okay, so v'Zav chamor mitmei sheretz. Okay, so now, and that's obvious. Well, maybe not necessarily. Umay chumrei kedamram. What? It's more chamor because Zav is 7 days and this isn't. But Adrabah, I'll tell you the reverse. Sheretz chamor shekem tameh ba'ones. If a sheretz falls upon you unexpectedly, or someone forces it upon you, that's tameh. You're tameh anyway. It doesn't make a difference whether it was intentional or not. Whereas when it comes to Zav, it's only someone who has this sickness and the discharge comes out because of that. If it comes out because the person ate too much food or the person had a fever and that caused it, that's not Zav. It's not. It has to be specifically this disease. They call it gonorrhea. Okay, that's what caused it, not onus. So they say that seems to be a chumrah then by sheretz. That's not. It seems sheretz now is more stringent. So they say Amri ki agavna Zav nami tamuye mitame ba'ones ke Rav Huna. There is an opinion that zav is mitame even ba'ones, even accidental. Rav Huna says, and that's why I set it up the first, the second, the third. If you see only one re'iyah in your tummy that day, Rav Huna holds that one tumah, that tumah zav, that's the light tumah, that is actually going to be applicable even if it was ones, even if it wasn't from this particular, it wasn't something else caused the discharge. So then you have it that it has the same thing as sheretz, and you can't say sheretz is more stringent, in which case, according to that, we can explain that zav is more stringent. Okay, and that's because zav has 7 days, and it has korban, and has all these things that aren't existing by sheretz. Okay, so once we include v'chol tameh, includes not just tameh lanefesh, but also other people impurities, then already we can obviously say, and that if it was just tameh meit, it wouldn't necessarily be clear that tameh meit, okay, and that's where we started yesterday. It's not so clear that tameh meit was less strict than zav, but once we include other things in it, then it becomes, there's certain things for sure that are less strict than the zav, and that's why that's the order. Now we have to deal with mitzorah and zav. How do we know mitzorah is more stringent than zav? Umay chumri de mitzorah mizav, shekain ta'un pri'ah ufrima v'asor b'tashmish hamita. There's certain laws about mitzorah, a leper, that only apply to a leper, and therefore it's going to show it's more severe. What is it? Pri'ah, you have to grow your hair. Prima, you have to tear your clothing. There's actually interesting different laws between men and women about this because of its niut reasons. We're not going to get into this here. It comes up in other places. You can't have sexual relations. So here you see that mitzorah has these things that don't exist by a zav. So they say, Adraba, zav chamur, shekem mitamei mishkav u'moshav u'mitamei kli cheres beheset. But wait, zav has other things. In other words, again, you could say that's strict because of that, but I could say this is strict because of this. What's moshav u'mishkav? Remember, that's the type of tumah where you sit on something. I always think of the princess and the pea. You could be on 13 mattresses and there's a little pea underneath, right? Assuming the pea is the pea actually is food, it would work. The pea would become tameh. Okay, even though, right, that's the whole story of the princess and the pea. You can't feel anything, right? How can you feel that little teeny pea? The point is anything that the zav sits on, okay, even if he's not touching it, becomes tameh. And tumat hesed is if I move, let's say my elbow moves a chair and the chair moves a kli, that also, okay, it's indirect moving. I've moved that kli and it will be tameh for a zav, which doesn't exist by mitzorah. So here you see zav has other chumrot. So they do the exact same thing they did in the first case, which was to say, amal kha zav v'chol zav. Again, the pasuk doesn't just say zav, it says v'chol zav, and all zav. So what does all come to include? L'rabot bal keri, comes to talk about a man who sees semen comes out. So we're going to say that's obviously a much lighter tumah. That doesn't have korban, doesn't have 7 days. That's a much lighter tumah, and that's clearly less than mitzorah, which is 7 days and all those other things. So now they say, wait, mitzorah chamor mibal keri umay chumre kida amaran, right? So now you're going to say, okay, so mitzorah is obviously more stringent than the bal keri. Again, we're going to say zav itself maybe not, but chol zav includes something that's lighter, and therefore obviously that's lighter. So now they're going to say, wait. My chumre kidamaran, you're going to say what? It's obvious that mitzorah is more strict, but like you said before, because it has pri'ah, prima, sorbatesh mishamita, which is not the bal keri. Adraba, bal keri chamor shekem tameh b'mashu. But wait, there's a stringency about a bal keri that any amount of semen, even a teeny bit, will make the person tameh. That's a stringency that doesn't appear by mitzorah. So they say you could just say that Rabbi Shimon, who thinks again. This Rabbi Shimon set up, he was the one who set this up, that there's a level hierarchy here. The lowest is tameh meit, which is really only low because it includes sheretz. Above that is the zav, which is really only below the mitzorah because it includes the bal keri. Above that is the mitzorah. He must hold like Rabbi Natan. Tanya Rabbi Natan omer mishum Rabbi Yishmael, zav tzarich kachatimat pi ha'ama v'lohodu lo chachamim. Says the zav needs the amount to come out that it would cover the opening of the man's private parts. So it would basically be, right, it needs more to come out than a mashu. And he said it about a zav, but it kishle bal keri lezav. The pasuk makes a connection. I'll read you the verse. I even put it on the sheet so you'd have it. In Vayikra Tevav Lamed Bet, it says, Zot Torat Hazav ve'asher tetzei mimenu shechvat zera. It puts in the same verse the zav and the shechvat zera, the semen. So they say, Here you have the Baal Keri is the same as a Zav. So if you're going to say the Zav needs a certain amount, according to Rabbi Natan, it's not enough b'mashu, he would say the same for Baal Keri, which means there's no stringency about this Baal Keri needing a mashu because Rabbi Shimon must hold like Rabbi Natan. Okay, if he held like someone else, then he wouldn't necessarily set this up like this. Okay, now, there's one last question on this section, which is, okay, so we explained, in order to get to the hierarchy, we explained the word v'chol included other types of things, right, that were lesser of importance. Now we say, or less stringent. Now we say, well, there's a problem. The pasuk then should have said, because you don't need v'chol by tzarua, v'chol zav, v'chol tamei lanefesh. So v'chol tzarua, what's that coming to do? What's it including? Right? Each kol included something. Kol tzarua lamali. So they say, very interesting answer, because usually we say there's no extra words in the Torah. Say, I did the katav kol zav, katav nami kol tzarua. Once you had the kol and the zav, and you had the kol and the tamei nefesh, so for literary reasons, they added the chol tzarua, because it would have sounded weird if you did tzarua, the chol zav, the chol tamei nefesh. So in fact, that word is really unnecessary. It's there for literary purposes. It's a bit of a strange answer in light of all sorts of things that we always say. We always darshan every single word. Anyway, that's the answer here. So now they go back and they say, wait, Rabbi Yehuda, Shapir Ka'amar Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon has a good claim. Again, this goes back to what I said in the beginning. If you can prove it all from the pasuk that there's this hierarchy and each one is allowed in a different machaneh, all is learned from the pasuk v'yishalchum machaneh, and he kind of proved it pretty well. So why would you take some pasuk from Vayikra about Mitzorah to explain that? It seems very weird. Rabbi Shimon has a pretty good claim. Now you could make some answers. Rabbi Shimon, we had to say he relied on Rabbi Natan, he relied on this opinion, and maybe, but the fact is better to learn it from that verse than go to some outside verse. So he says no, because that pasuk I need for something else. I needed it for the following braita. When you he needs to teach us something else. What is it coming to teach us? Rabbi Lezer Homer, oh, it's coming to teach us this halacha we already learned today. Makes at least this part of the daf easier because we already learned this. You might have thought what? That the Zavinu Mitzoraim that come into the Azara on Pesach on a year when the majority of the people are Tme'im and everyone's coming in anyway, you might think that if they come in, they'll be Chayavim still because there's no heter for them. They weren't allowed. Maybe they'll also get lashes for coming. Talmud Lomar, now instead of, in the first drasha, the whole idea was there's a hierarchy. Each one is different. This is to say there's something that's common to all three. And what is that? The isur to be outside the camp is only when Tmei Mate can't go into the camp. But on a year where we're going to allow all the Tmei Mate team, then it's not like you're allowed to come in, but you're not going to get lashes. You're not getting punished if you come in on that kind of year. So it's saying it only applies when it's equal to all three, when none of them are allowed in. If it's a year where we allow those in, then, and the others come in, they're not going to get lashes. And that he learns from that verse, which means that he can't start darshaning. This is to teach you that Mitzorah is out of all three, and Zav is out of two, and Tmei is out of one. Okay, that's what he basically says. Okay, last section for today. Amar Mar. Zav v'chol zav l'rabot Baal Keri. Now we're going to say that this word v'chol zav, like we said before, we're just quoting this drasha from before, includes a Baal Keri. Misayel Rabbi Yochanan. This seems to support the statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Why? Dama Rabbi, right? It's always good if you can take a braita and say this supports something an Emora said. Why? So let's see. Dama Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said two things. It's not clear if these two are interrelated or not. I'll interrelate them, at least according to the opinion that they are. Mechilot lo nitkatshu. There were these underground tunnels in the temple. Those who learned Masechet Midot will remember. Those who didn't, we'll get to it much later on in the cycle. There were these underground tunnels in the temple. And he says they're not sanctified. So whereas the Azara above is sanctified, but the underground tunnels are not. Ubal keri mishtalech chutz l'shnei machanot. He also said that a Baal Keri has to go outside of two machanot. So here you see a Baal Keri is treated like a Zav because the pasuk didn't say Baal Keri, it only said Zav. So this braita must support that second part of Rabbi Yochanan. How do you connect these two? Because if a Baal Keri has to go outside of two machanot, what happens if a Baal Keri is in the temple and all of a sudden you realize, you see some semen and you got to get out of there as quickly as possible? How do you get out? You have to walk through the Azara. So he says that the mechilot, the underground tunnels, weren't sanctified. So he would walk right down to the underground tunnels, and that's how he would get out, right? You never think about it. But if you become tamei in the temple, how on earth do you get out? Because you're not allowed to be there. So you have to pass through. So it could be that that's connected. Okay, we'll start with one question, Rabbi Yochanan, and we'll finish here for today. Meitive. Baal keri kemagasheret. But wait, it says a baal keri is like someone who touches the sheretz. Now, he just said it's outside of 2 machanot, but a sheretz is only outside 1 machanet, right? Only can't go into the azara, is allowed in Har Bayit. So, my love, when this Braita puts the baal keri like a magash sheretz, they assume it means lemachanotam. How many machanot do you have to leave? How many camps do you have to be excluded from? They say lo letumatam. No, what it means is it's the same level of tuma. What would it mean it's the same level of tuma? Well, I said this before. Both the baal keri is tamei just that day, goes to the mikveh already, and likewise the tamei sheretz. But if you want to say letumatam, you wouldn't need a braita to tell you that. Hi tumat erev ktive, hi tumat erev ktive. Both of them, it says in the Torah, tamei ada erev, which means you're tamei that day. You don't need a braita to tell you something it says explicitly in the Torah, and therefore we're back to square one. Elalav lemachanotam. It must be to say you only have to leave one camp, and that would disagree with what we said that the baal keri is like the zav. So they say lo laolam letumatam. You could still say it's letumatam, but it's coming to teach you something else. V'hakamash malan de baal keri kimagash sheretz. Ma magash sheretz mitame ba'ones, af baal keri mitame ba'ones. To teach you this law of onus that we discussed before, that if a sheretz falls upon you unexpectedly, someone else threw it on you or something like that, you had nothing to do with it, you still become tameh. Likewise, a baal keri, it's the same thing. It doesn't matter what caused the semen to come out, that will cause you to become tameh. Okay, we're going to continue on tomorrow with more questions against this statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, so we learned a lot of new concepts today. I hope it wasn't too many. And, as I said, all these new concepts, if you don't get them now, we're going to see them many, many, many more times in the Gemara. So don't despair.